My name is John Ross from the Art of Retouching Studio, and this is Behind the Retouching, where I review images that were retouched by my students, where I help them improve their images. Today's image is brought to us by Noureddine M, who is both the retoucher as well as the photographer. This file, as it was supplied to me, has a liquefied layer on top, a group 1 in the middle, and then an original background image. So if I hide the top two, this is actually the original image as it was photographed. So once again, here's the before and here's the after. The biggest change that you can probably see, other than the darkening of the background, which was an excellent choice, is also that the waistline was slimmed down. Well, this gets into the whole arguable topic of whether women should have their figures resized or not. I'm one of those that believes that as long as it fits within reality, I'm 100% okay with it. And obviously, this simply does slim down the model. She looks fine, and I'm okay with it. If we have completely lost her waist, that's where the problem would come in. Now, the other area that was really focused on was the face. So I'm going to zoom in here on the face, and I'm going to show the before and after. Here is the before, and there's the after. Before and after. I think generally it was a huge improvement on the image. The bags under the eyes were lightened, but the eyes themselves were actually kept dark. Now, there are different thought processes behind the eyes. There's times that the eyes should be brighter for makeup type of photography, and then there's times that it should be darkened more for beauty. I'm one of those that takes the side of brightness and enhancing the eyes. However, in this particular case, I think keeping them dark certainly helps it add that edge to the image. As it stands, I don't have a problem with the retouching that was done on the face, and largely I'm just going to leave that alone. What does kind of bother me with the image, though, in general, is these areas that come along and appear to be blown out. Now, if I open up the info palette and you look over at the CMYK area, you can see that there is actually texture left behind. So while technically, the issue that I actually have with it is that you don't see as much detail as you once did. Additionally, if I were to zoom in, you can see that there's texture and then a stop of texture. You know, something is happening here, and I have to review this to be 100% certain, but I'm pretty sure this breakup in the texture is actually happening inside of the raw processing. Because if I hide everything else and show just the raw file, it actually looks worse. Now, I'm pretty sure the camera didn't do this, which leaves it to the raw processor, which is a core problem that we need to correct on the front end. While I understand the need for the brightness and the contrast and the punch and all that, in this case, you're just losing texture, and that can be fixed with a change in the beginning of the process. The same thing is happening through here and other areas. For example, down here in the pants. Now, inside of the breakdown of the layer structure that what we have here is we have the original image, and built on top of that are several layers of frequency separation and dodge and burn, which is a standard within professional photo retouchers. However, for the purposes of this video, I'm probably not going to get into that because this is a video specifically intended for the person who worked on the image. They don't need to know what they've done right. They only need to understand what they did wrong. So largely, I'm not going to go too far backward, only go forward. However, in this case, because we have the core fundamental problem of blowout, and even though there's texture in there, the blowout is considered a lack of texture. I'm actually going to go back to the original raw file to try and extract that data before it's lost and improve upon the image as we go along. Now, this is the original raw image. So what I'm going to start off with are some basic color and tonal changes. Simply by coming in here within this base palette, we can make many of our changes right here. So I'm going to drop these highlights down because they're too bright. I'm going to open up the shadows because those are too dark. Then I'm going to grab the blacks and put that contrast back into the image. Open up the exposure a little bit. And somewhere in here, we found a happy medium to get started with. So inside of Camera Raw, in the more recent versions, down here is your before and after. In the older versions, it's up here at the top. But for right here, I'm going to click the before and the after. Now, at this point, you can look at it and say, well, the before of the image was darker and she was brighter, so she came forward. But because of these changes that I made, I actually brightened up the background as well as the foreground. Now, I am aware of that, and we can correct for that at a different point in time with different tools. Simply, it's a matter of choosing your battles at the right time. And my goal is to retain the detail of the model. If we were to zoom in to these areas that previously had detail lost, if we were to zoom into these areas where the detail was previously lost, you're going to find a bit of a mixed bag. Meaning that if I come in here to the blouse area, you're going to see that there is still plenty of detail going on in here. You can see the streaks. And because I didn't push it so far, we didn't lose that detail. However, in other areas like down here, you can see the detail is lost. However, that's not a problem with the raw processing. That goes back to the photography and the lighting that was used. Now, I can pull this back and I can pull back that detail, but effectively what happens is the rest of the image is going to go dark. So what I'm forced to do is handle certain situations in different ways, meaning I need to handle it as a global change before I handle it as a local change. So I'm going to undo this change I made to bring us back to this overexposure of 0.40, simply because my goal is to get her face and to get her stomach and these flesh tones to be kind of where I want them to be, because those are the most important parts of this image to me right now. The last change I'm going to make inside of this particular panel is to boost the vibrance. Now, in many cases, I boost the saturation as opposed to the vibrance because the saturation boosts the warms, vibrance will boost the cools. However, I want to go with the vibrance, which is the cools, because I want to put a little bit more punch inside of what she's wearing, as well as the lower area of her pants. The next thing that I want to do is address where I'm looking. If you've ever watched any of my other behind the scene videos, you'll see that I often comment on the fact that my eye is very distracted. Should I be looking here? Is it over here? Is it down here? Is it up here? I really don't know. So a way that I correct that problem is to go to the graduated filter. And I'll click on this, and by default, it picks up the last settings used, which in this case was -10 for the highlights. But simply, I'm going to grab at the bottom of this image and drag upward. And then somewhere around here, I'll let go. Do you see a change here? No, because it's only -10 in the highlights. So I'm going to bring this highlights down further so that we reduce the amount of highlight that's going on in the lower half of her body. Now, because this lower half is so bright, I can grab the exposure as well and bring that down. Now, here's where it becomes a little bit of a balance. I don't want to make it too much so that it looks like I intentionally darken the bottom. But at the same time, I don't want your eye wandering all over the image. I want to keep it focused here, which is the intent of this photograph. So again, it's a balance. And so somewhere in here, I think is generally okay. I'm going to grab from the top and drag down as well. And once again, I'm creating another darkening effect to bring your eye into the center. Now, by using the same settings I had at the bottom, this top part becomes dark. And it looks obvious that I did this, especially with the bottom. So I'm going to pull back on this exposure so it's not quite as heavy-handed, so it isn't as obvious. Now, the other thing I'm going to do is actually come in from the sides because I don't want your eye just wandering anywhere. So I'll come in from the sides a bit like this so that we have this angle to it. And then once again, drop this down. Now, what happens here in this area is pretty straightforward. But what will end up happening in the top and the bottom, because we already have the gradient coming from the top and bottom, is you'll actually get a double hit in these areas. So we don't want the sides, in this case, to be as strong. So by coming in from this side, I'm also, once again, able to direct your attention. And when I hide this overlay, you can see that I've brought the attention of this entire image right into the focal point of the model, which is her face, the blouse, and her stomach. And the stomach isn't as bright as her face, technically speaking. So right now I'm okay with this image as it stands. And instead of open image, I'm going to hold down the shift key, which is going to turn this into an open object. And when I do that, I'm going to be opening up an image parallel to this one, which is my own, as a smart object. And now because this is a smart object, I can always go back to the raw file and make further changes. Now, we can see immediately that one of the changes that was done previous to mine was a cropping, which I actually like. I like the cropping. So I agree with it. So let's go back to that cropping. Let's try and match what was already done. But because we've already come out of the raw processor, we have some problems with the cropping. We can't actually go back in here and do it again. So I'm just going to grab the crop tool and I'll bring it down. And now this is one of the things that was introduced in CS6 maybe, and I absolutely hate it. Hate it, hate it, hate it. Where I'm going on a roller coaster ride. I don't know whether I'm cropping in or going around or what's going on. I hate it. So I'm going to click on this sprocket right here and use classic mode. And as soon as I do that, simply where I drag is where it's going. This is way easier for me, and I'm just going to go with this. So I'm going to roughly match what was done previously, and then just hit the enter key and resize it. So while not absolutely perfect, it's close enough. So now if I can draw your attention back to the student's version and my version, basically what you're going to see is that mine has retained all this lost detail in the original image. Now, that doesn't mean I'm completely done yet. I'm most certainly not done yet. But you can see that I haven't lost any information. But I can certainly agree with the choices that were made here. It has a little bit more punch, more contrast. It's a little bit more interesting. So let's go back into the raw processor and try and match that. And that's absolutely right. We can go back into the raw processor because we open this as a smart object. All I need to do is double click on the thumbnail, and once again, we're going to be put back into Camera Raw. That is the beauty of smart objects. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to push this highlight a little bit further to closer match what the student had envisioned. I'm going to go OK. And at this point, while I think it might be a little bit on the dark side, especially compared to theirs, I really don't want to change it because I'm trying not to be influenced by what they've done. And I want you to understand where I'm going. One of the places I'm going is I want to darken up this background. So the only way to actually darken up this background is to create a mask around the model. And if we were to grab the background, then we have all this distraction of darks and lights, and any automated tools will probably be a little bit confused. I'm actually going to focus on grabbing the model herself. And the way that I'm going to do that is to be using select color range. However, before I do that, we have to fix some fundamental problems with Photoshop. And to do that, we double click on this icon right here, which is the quick mask, and we change it from the default of quick mask to selected area, and we change it from the default opacity of 50% to 100%, and I recommend changing it from the default red to green. If you would like to learn more about that, I have videos on my website, www.theartofretouching.com, that goes into more explanation of color range as well as quick mask. But once we come out of there, it's still selected. We have to uncheck that and then go select color range. By default, it is set to none, which doesn't help us. So we're going to change this to quick mask. Now we can actually select whatever we want. As I mentioned previously, if we select the background, it's going to end up grabbing too much, parts of her hair and things. So rather, what I want to do is grab the model first, which has a color shift from the background. So let's take our time and do this. So now, because this is an incredibly busy image, there's not much I can do to tighten this. So I'm simply going to leave this alone and correct it inside of Quick Mask. I'm going to click OK, and then I'm going to go into Quick Mask. And now I can use my brush tool with brush. White is erase, black equals green. And so simply I'm going to come along here and I'm going to, with white, erase these areas on the outside. I'm going to click the brush and tighten this up, maybe 80%, so I can come in closer. Now, because this is a tutorial, I'm not going to get super crazy on the mask. If this was for real, I would zoom in really, really close and get it just right. Now I'm going to flip the brush around to black, and that means that I'm going to be working inside, and I'm going to be filling with green. Again, I would be a lot more intent if this was a real image, but for a tutorial, this is good enough. I'm going to come out of Quick Mask, and I now have a selection of the model. There are a variety of different ways to do it. This is the way that I choose to, because in a professional setting, this is going to give you the most accurate results when you zoom in and do it manually by hand. So now that I've created the selection of the model, I actually want the background, and I want to darken up the background. So I'm going to go select inverse. So now the background is selected, and then I'm going to use a curve to simply darken it. While I do prefer to work inside of Camera Raw as much as I possibly can, there are times once I introduce masks that I'm just simply better off doing it inside of adjustment layers. So now that I've darkened up behind the model, now is when I'm going to take the time to evaluate the tonal range of the image without being distracted by the actual colors that we see. To do that, I'm going to put a black and white filter over the top of any changes that I've made. And now we can look at this and we can evaluate it without being distracted by color. We can see where the brightest points in this image are and where the darkest points of the image are. Well, the darkest points are at the top and bottom, which is actually what I want. It's in the background, which is what I want. However, the whitest point is still down here in her jeans a little bit, and then up here in the blouse. Because the focal point should be her face, that's where I want to focus the brightest points to be. So in order to do that, I'm going to go back into Camera Raw. I'm going to double click on it, and that lets us come back in. And once again, that's the beauty of smart objects and smart filters. If you don't understand smart filters and smart objects, simply go to www.theartofretouching.com. And on the right-hand side, I have an entire class dedicated to this topic. So now, even though I'm looking at color, I know that my problem area is here and here, and I need to darken those a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab these highlights and bring them down just a little bit to darken them up, But then I'm going to come into her face and lighten it. And the way that I'm going to do that is to come over here to the adjustment brush. And basically this allows us to do what is called local adjustments. And the dialog box is going to look similar to this one, but when I click on it, it'll change just a little bit. Many of the options are the same, but some of them are a bit different. And what we can do in this case is we can create a mask and then make very specific changes. So in this case, it picks up the last change, which is minus 100, which we did earlier. So I'm going to open this up to plus 100. It's an arbitrary number. It doesn't matter. Simply, Camera Raw needs something to be entered in there. So I'm going to take a brush of appropriate size and dab in here a couple times. This is not accurate. This is roughly what I'm looking to do. And again, if this was a real image, I'd come in tighter and I'd be a little bit more accurate. But for our purposes right now, this is fine. If I want a little bit more, I can boost it and then grab these shadows and darken it just a little bit. I'm going to go OK and see what our results are when we get back into Photoshop with the grayscale attached to it. It's a little bit closer to what I want. Her face is lighter and the blouse is still a little bit too bright. It's distracting me a bit, and so is this. And I think perhaps the problem is because this middle skin is darker than both the surrounding objects. So I'm going to go back into the Camera Raw and adjust this once again. I'm going to click back on the adjustment brush, and this pin represents the change that we made original. You can see the mask, but instead of adding to it, I'm going to create a new one by simply painting new right here. And when I start, I'm not going to worry about how it actually looks because it's going to pick up the last settings. And I'm simply going to go back a little bit and adjust it. And I'm also going to create another new one, I think right here. And to show you, that's what I just painted. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to darken up these highlights down here. To once again pull your eye up. I'm going to go OK, and I'll simply evaluate what comes out. So now, as you can see, there's more of a balance to it and how this flows. Now, I'm still not convinced that this is correct because this is not the brightest part up top. So I really want to hit it one more time with a graduated filter to darken it going up. What I want to do is select the inside of the model here and simply adjust the color tone down here. While normally I would do it inside of Camera Raw once again. However, I've already done an adjustment just like this, and I don't want to repeat it. Mainly because this background is already at a tone I like. I simply want to affect the model, not the background. So I'm going to go into the Quick Mask tool. I'm going to click on it. Then I'll go to the Gradient tool, and I'll click from the bottom and bring it up. So if you notice, I've grabbed a gradient and I've darkened going upward through her stomach into the blouse. I'm going to come out of Quick Mask, and as you can see, it made a selection of some sort for me. I want to refine this a little bit by basically narrowing down this selection so that it's the inside, not the outside, or the model and not the background. I can do that by using this right here. Because I've already created a mask of the model that I don't want to go through creating again, I can hold down the Command key on a Mac or the Control key on a PC, and it changes to a control. Now watch what happens. If I click it, it's going to select the background again, and that isn't quite what I want. So I'm going to undo this. I'm going to hold down my Control Alt key, and notice it changes to a minus. So it's going to minus this selection. Is that what I want? Yes, it is. So here I went from one selection of the gradient to using an existing mask to refine that gradient. So now I have this selected on the inside of the model only. So now I can correct this by using a curve. So I'm going to go to a curve adjustment. I'm going to bring it down to darken it. And so now I've darkened the lower part of this image. When I turn off the black and white, when I turn off this layer, you can see the large change that I've made between the curve as well as the earlier change of camera raw. And when I do this, it keeps altering the color of the pants. They keep getting bluer and bluer and starting to actually surpass this original blouse. And that's not what I want to do at all. And the problem is coming from the camera raw change. And we can't affect the camera raw directly. So what we need to do is mask out these pants by themselves. And the way that I'm going to do that is this. I'm going to grab the original mask that we had already previously created up here. I'm going to hold down once again the Command key on a Mac or Control key on a PC and click. It's going to grab the selection of the background. When I go into Quick Mask, I can see what is selected and what's not selected. I'll zoom in and I will use my brush, check that it's at 80% hardness so that it's a nice hard edge, and black equals green, so I want white so I can erase whatever thing is going on inside of here because I have that very loose mask to begin with. I wouldn't have this problem if I had done this properly to begin with. Then up here, I actually want to remove all this. So I'll come back to black. Now, once again, I'll say that if this was for real, I'd get all up close and make sure it's accurate. But for what I'm doing right here, it's fine. And simply remove all this. When I come out of the quick mask, we have everything selected. So we go select inverse to grab just the pants. Now that we have just the pants selected, I'm going to use this to remove all this color. And I'll do that by clicking on the black and white filter. This time I'll actually use it, unlike the layer on top, which I'm just using as a tonal adjustment for myself. I'll put this up here. And you can see that it made it very strangely colored for the image because it made it just straight black and white. I'm not going to leave it that way. I'll actually bring the opacity down to 0 and then gradually increase it until we find a balance between the blue that was and the black and white that I actually want, because they're just jeans, right? They're white jeans. They're not supposed to be any special color. But if you completely remove color, then it becomes obvious. So now that we've done this to the image and I look at this, my first reaction at this point is that it's starting to get very dark. So that's something that's bothering me. I might have gone a little too far, and that's fine. You know why it's fine? Because I've only have 1, 2, 3, 4 layers that I'm currently dealing with. All I'm doing is jumping back and forth, and this is not a problem. So let's evaluate where the core problems are. I'll turn back on our black and white layer and evaluate the tone itself. And in general, I like this because it goes from dark to middle to a little bit light. And when I turn off the top layer, we can see that this visually, once including the color, is clearly the whitest part of the image. I really don't want to whiten this anymore, even though in this version, it looks kind of like a match. So I'm going to turn that off. And I'm going to say, okay, where is the core problem of why I think it's too dark? Is it the pants or is it the background? Is it that her face is too bright? Where is it? Before I make the change, I want to think about what's kind of bothering me. And I think what's bothering me is that her pants don't match this background. Like it's too dark back here. And while I do like that it's dark, it may be a little bit too much. Okay, maybe. So let's identify where that change came from. This darkened background came from this curve right here, that looks mostly okay. And when we turn it on, it becomes obvious. So simply, let's pull back on the opacity. And we bring it to something that actually looks proper for the image. If we largely like the way that the model is looking, which I believe I am, I mean, I see the detail in here. We're going to still talk about this a little bit, but largely I think this is good. I'm okay with this. Yep, I'm okay with that. So that actually introduces the other topic, which gets into a little bit into details, which is these areas up here that got lost because of our tonal changes that we made. Well, where do we make those changes? Back here inside of Camera Raw. So once again, the beauty of Smart Objects is let's go back into the raw file and make some changes to this. I'm going to double click on that background layer. And now I can come into the raw file, and I'm going to come in here, zoom in nice and close. And now I showed that a lot of this detail could come back by adjusting this exposure and the highlights. However, I don't want to do it on the whole image. I only want to be very specific. So I'm going to go to the local adjustment here, new, and then I'm going to come in and I'm going to paint in this area. Now, the first thing I notice up here is that because of the original -100 here, there's no detail to be found. Okay, so me darkening this isn't going to help anything. That was never shot as part of the camera. So all I can do at this point is just click that and delete. Hit the delete key because I can't save that. So let's come back down here to this area here. And mostly the detail is in here. I'm good with it, except it's kind of lost in here. So let's get ourselves a bigger brush. And we're going to start by simply painting this in. It's going to look wrong, but we're just going to paint it in. It's actually not that bad. I'm going to drop down the highlights just a little bit, simply because I want it lighter, but I still want detail. And then I'll erase part of this. And I think that's about all I can save from that. Because that is what it is. This I brought back, and her pants are otherwise fine. So I'll click OK. I'll zoom out, and now we can see this is where the image is going. And I think the core question here is, does it do what we needed it to do, which is bring the attention up here to whatever the model is doing? And I think generally, yes. I mean, maybe the belly is a little bright, to be honest with you, because it's pulling me back down, but mostly it's okay. I could say that it might still be a little bit dark down here, but I don't think the problem is actually here on the background. It's going to be on the pants, where we want to darken the lights, but not go so dark with the darks. Perhaps something along these lines. When we check it to the black and white, looks good. I'm happy with that. When we check it to this, mostly okay. I don't have too much of a problem with that. Then when we go back to the original image, you should be able to see the huge difference that's happening here. Now, you may not agree 100% with the changes that I've made, which is fine. Even I don't agree with everything I've made because I'm sitting here, I'm talking, I'm teaching, I'm not thinking fast and doing it and evaluating it. But I think the core thing here that you can get out of this is that a lot of this lost detail is brought back. The attention is brought up to the face and not everywhere. And I do like what was done to the background, the way the balance works, perhaps a little bit better than mine, which is fine. But as long as you understand the differences, that's the important part. When we zoom into some of these details, like up here under her eyes, I think you absolutely nailed it. I like what's happening there. However, I can say this, that I don't see hair. I do see hair, and I don't see hair. So basically, we need to remove this hair from your image. And the way that we would do that, because it looks really hard, but it's actually not, is to come up here under the healing spot healing brush, which is the first one. And because you have this liquefy, which by the way is a separate topic altogether, if I click on liquefy, not only do you have this liquefy going on down here in the waist, which is fine, but you also liquefied up here as well. And this is actually doesn't work for me. It doesn't work at all, because when you get in here, you can see how it's stretching the pixels and then you still miss parts. So this looks hokey. It doesn't work at all. So I would recommend fixing this with the clone stamp. Um, Getting to this point is fine, but the clone stamp is what needs to be done. And I'll also point out, I'm segueing here, but because this liquefy is on top, you could turn the rest of this off and it doesn't matter anymore. As you may have seen with mine, it very much does matter. And even if I wanted to create a liquefy in here, I could simply go back to the core layer and do the liquefy up here. I wouldn't do that, but I could. If I wanted to adjust her waist, I would have done that on the very front end as one of the first things that I had done, instead of now that I have all these other masks. Meaning I would have liquefied first, then done the masks second. Because I have all these masks, I would have to do it a different way, and I'm not going to get into that in this particular video. Simply, I'm pointing out that this doesn't work for me. It's close. I mean, you have the gradients and stuff, but when you get up here, this doesn't work. Um, I guess perhaps at this point, if I create a clone layer on top, with the clone layer, with the healing brush, current and below, you can see that I can click here and then come up here, and we can actually put that texture back into it while still retaining the tone. So this at least works, whereas yours did not. So we'll just get in here and get it a little bit more accurate, as well as this black line. Do that with a clone stamp at this point. So as I was saying, we had this hair under here. So we'll use the spot healing brush. And by default, it might be set to proximity match, which is very, very wrong. Make sure it's on content aware. Sample all layers so that it goes below. And give yourself a very small brush. All you want to do is cover the offending area. Go in different directions. Go over it several times, whatever it takes. And mostly you should be able to clear this up in a generally appeasing way. And I will kind of fill this back in with the brush. I'll use the eyedropper to grab that shade of black or blue. Come up underneath there. And just kind of fake it, mainly because this is such a small area within this image, it really doesn't matter. At the very least, it looks better than it used to. Here you had all the hair falling under the eye, and there it's gone. Now, maybe one of the other things I would actually say about these eyes, perhaps, is that they're a little too dark. I mean, I get the lighting and I get the tone of the image, but perhaps just a little bit brighter coming through here. So I'll go to black and white, open up the brush, 20% hardness, kind of swipe underneath the eyes, come out of the quick mask, curves. And now, when it comes to the whites of the eyes, it's a very touchy subject, but we just want to do enough to give it a little bit of a sparkle in there. Now, because this particular image was taken so far back, because we have the full figure, we are actually losing quite a bit of detail inside of the face. So I think that the retouching that was currently done was fine. So I don't want to play with any of that. I might say that this is a little dark underneath uh, because it doesn't seem to match anything else. Simply a little bit of a quick mask. Come out of it, curve, and lighten is about all that it actually needs. So from this point, if we could get your image to be a closer match to my image, just a little bit. I mean, you have your own artistic integrity, you have your own vision, and that's fine. But because there's a lack of detail going on inside of certain areas, we can certainly bring them back by handling the image a little bit better on the front end, as well as the fact that it's brighter down at the bottom of the image than it is up here at the focal point. If we can correct that a little bit, then that would certainly go a long way towards correcting this image and bringing the attention where it needs to be and centering it once again where it needs to be. While many of my students actually look for these great revelations in technique and style and retouching the details out, it isn't always about that. You know, a lot of these images just fall flat because they don't look at the overall image and bring it where it needs to be. In this case, your technique in this particular image is actually quite nice. I don't have a problem with it. It's simply being able to understand the image as a whole, as a composition, and bringing it where it needs to go in post-production closer to where you might have envisioned it in the pre-production. And then there's also the topic of understanding where this might be printed in a magazine and what the magazine needs in order to hit all of these details. So it's perfectly understandable to brighten out certain areas to create certain depth of the image. The only real problem I have in this particular case is that the fabric is what's brighter than the skin, and that's really not what I think you intended to do. Now, when I work on my images, most times I just work on them and I move them along. I really don't put a whole lot of thought into them unless they really mean something to me, or they just happen to be really big projects that I go back several times, or whatever the case is. And this image is one of those examples that I just haven't been able to actually walk away from. There's been something about it that's really been gnawing at me, and I really have a hard time really putting my finger on it. And I've been looking at this image a couple times over the past few days, and I just wanted to follow up with a couple thoughts of my own based off of the work that I recommended and thought about and said. And I actually, you know, there are a lot of things that I liked about the student's image as opposed to my image. And then there's things about my image that I like a little bit better. So what I wanted to do is just take a moment to actually focus in on some things that I thought it needed as an afterthought to the core of the video, how I had originally done it. And one of the things is this hair. I happen to like this hair just hanging in her face. I don't know why. I think it's okay because, you know, her hair is otherwise just kind of all over the place. And it really doesn't bother me. You know, one of those things, I don't know. I happen to like it. And it's okay with it gone, but I happen to like it actually in there. And that's one of the things that struck me. The other thing that struck me is I don't like this patch right here. The reason is because when you back off a little bit in the image, you still see this clump of hair on her, and I don't like that. So what I would actually say is that this should be removed. So if I come back over here to your image, just because a lot of the work is already done, I would just put a new clone layer on top of this and select the clone stamp just to get started, and simply do something very simple like this. Now it looks a little funny like this, and I get that because that happens. But the goal here is to cover first, then use the healing brush second to do the blending for you. Let me show you. Now I'm going to use this. I'm going to set my point and then come in a second time, and you'll see that it starts to blend it a bit better by using the clone stamp first and then the second. And then I can use my eraser simply touch it up a little bit. You know, something like that. I mean, basically, this way when you zoom all the way out, it isn't something that immediately catches your attention. Okay, so those were two things that were on my mind. Something else that's been on my mind, well, I often like to keep the eyes open a little bit more. I actually like that yours are dark. I wouldn't actually want you to lighten those. I mean, I've been thinking about it for a while, and I like them dark. I think about the only thing I would do is enhance these catch lights. I think it's the catch lights that are too dark, not necessarily the whole thing. Previously, I used a quick mask and swiped the entire eye, but I don't think I want to do that. What I think I would like to do is this. I'll take a brush that's small and create a new layer. How you handle the layers is totally up to you. It doesn't matter to me. I'm simply just moving quickly. And I'll take this with white, and I will hit that. I know this looks a little odd. And then we can drop the opacity down and then bring it back just a little bit. So this could actually be done with a brush the way that I did it, or a curve is another way with a quick mask. So now I think I would probably just do a little bit like this, and I'd end up splitting it because these two catch lights are a little bit much. So I think what I would do is one for that and then another one for that. And again, how you end up doing this, there's like 50 different ways to achieve it. You see how I split that light? One's not as bright as the other, and the other's not as dark. But I think that's actually the solution that I really wanted to go for. And I'll tell you, you know, walking away from images really does help. It helps you clear your brain so that you don't just get into this rut of doing the same thing the same way over and over again. Just break that visual thing of you sitting there in front of the computer for the past hour. Just walk away, come back, and change your opinion of it. That often helps. Now, this was another thing that was really bothering me. This is just some stray fabric that really doesn't belong here. So very simply, just clone this out. This should definitely not be here. So with the healing brush, click the line and follow the contour of the line. Now, as I look at it, there's another thing that I would probably correct is this ear. You know, it just has this funny shape to it. I mean, really all it needs is a little bit of liquefy. So I'll just very quickly do it this way. Something like that, just so it isn't so protruding. Okay. And then after you do that, I would suggest coming back in with the clone stamp and just remove this. Well, we all know she has earrings. Actually, showing the hole in her head just kind of looks a little off in the image when she doesn't have any actual earring in her ear. Now, the other thing that I was thinking about on this is the amount of wrinkles that are here. Now, I'm usually pretty easygoing when it comes to wrinkles. I mean, the big ones can stay, they look fine, they make sense, but it was kind of bothering me that you just have these wrinkles from where it was last folded and or thrown in the corner or washed or whatever it is, and it just there's something about it that was just bothering me. So a quick simple fix is to once again use the healing brush and just simply remove some of the more obvious wrinkles that just don't belong. Okay, all it takes is just a little bit of cleanup, and you'll end up having this fabric looking much cleaner than it did before. Okay, so in general, you get the idea. Just all these little ones can go. And then probably the last thing I would do would be any of these things against this wall that are obvious and distracting from a distance. Meaning, obvious and distracting is this one right here. So that I would simply take out. Once again, the healing brush will make very quick work of it. Like this here, this there, this one. Just anything that makes you second guess. That there, that one. Just if you back off and it catches your attention, then do something about it. And now, one last thing that I want to offer is this. While you want to retain the detail in your images as much as you can when you want to, there may be times that you want to blow away the side of a face or something like that. And so artistic intent is fine. But one of the key cornerstones to a good image is nice contrast, having good punch to the image. So the whites are a little bit too white and the blacks are a little bit too black, and the midtones are often opened up in a way that you don't lose detail and you don't notice what happened. It's a lot of what happens inside of your image that's good because you have a lot of good contrast to your image, although it's definitely too much within the fabric. Mine comes off as flat, and I'm aware of that, and that's one of the things that's been bothering me. So a very quick, simple fix to this is to take a curve right over the top of the whole thing and bring the whites up a little bit and bring the blacks down a little bit. And very simply and very quickly, that right there added a bunch of contrast to the image. But when you do it with curves like this, it'll also add saturation as well. So change the blend mode to luminosity, and then this way it won't saturate the image while you add that punch into the image. So I'm sure you can see pretty easily that with a very simple curve, I was able to get a very dynamic image that still retained the core qualities that allowed your viewer's eye to go right to the center point of the image, which is right here, which is where all the interest is. So as long as I come back in here to review it and I still have all my texture and all my detail as best as I can, recall this was blown out previously and that's blown out a bit. So I would, on this curve mask, paint that in a little bit just so that I don't lose detail in those areas. Now, just because I did it overall does not mean it needs to stay that way. like that. Okay, so in this case, I've retained the detail, but I've added the punch and the contrast and everything else. And I think I'm much happier with this. And I think this is where I was trying to go the other day, where at this point you can clearly see that the difference between the two images, and making some very subtle shifts can bring you into the right direction to create a very dynamic looking image. My name is John Ross for the Art of Retouching Studio. Please go to www.theartofretouching.com, where you can learn more tips and tricks to make you a better photo retoucher.